monogamy has somehow become the default. Commitment should be based on desire and choice and honesty.
Okay, but if we just put theory aside for a second, I just don't think it's really possible to love more than one person, you know? Like, with all your heart, to really love them.
I'm just trying to figure out if you were your parents' favorite child or least favorite child. Both can be taxing.
I'm an only child?
They couldn't have had any more. There wasn't room in their hearts.
It's not really the same with children, though, is it?
No, obviously not.
Well, that depends whether you believe in some transhistoric and culturally consistent concept of romantic love. I guess we all believe in silly things, don't we?
When it comes to internet trends and aesthetically driven thematic fads, sad girl core has to be one of the most persistent. While the genesis of modern sad girl culture on the internet is highly debated, sad girl literature goes as far back as Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. For those who might be unfamiliar with the story, The Bell Jar chronicles a short period of aspiring poet and student Esther Greenwood's life. Over the course of the book, Esther becomes a guest editor for a magazine, makes several failed attempts to lose her virginity, breaks up with her college boyfriend after he cheats on her, and ultimately ends up in the psych ward of the hospital after multiple attempts to take her life. Following the horrible experience she has in the city's local hospital, Esther's very kind benefactor pays to move her to a private psych ward. In this newfound nurturing environment with proper care and friendship, Esther begins to improve. She does, however, disapprove of her new friend Joan's sexual advancements towards her. The story wraps with a few significant events. Esther finally loses her virginity, she officially ends things with Buddy, and Joan, sadly, takes her own life. Although Esther is able to return to college feeling fully in control of herself for the time being, she recognizes that the titular bell jar of madness could only just be around the corner for her. Even though the 1960s saw the rise of the second wave of the American feminist movement, writing a character like Esther, who is blatantly depicted struggling with mental illness, would have been a bold choice for a female author depicting a female character. In fact, when The Bell Jar was first published in 1963, Plath did so under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas. As a work of autofiction, Esther's struggles with what seemed to be depression and bipolar disorder heavily mirrored Plath's own experiences. Sylvia Plath sadly took her own life 1 month after her book was first published in the UK. Although it would take several years for it to be published under her name, and nearly a decade after its initial publication for it to be published in the US, The Bell Jar has managed to remain a relevant and important work in modern pop culture.
Look, Mitch, I don't conform to typical high school norms, okay? I read Sylvia Plath.
While I highly doubt Sylvia Plath could have ever dreamed that one day women around the world would view Esther's story as a staple of sad girl culture, or even the existence of such a thing, if her ultimate goal with the book was to help other women feel less alone in their struggles, I'd say she succeeded tenfold. And ever since, sad girl culture as a whole has had modern women in a chokehold with music, movies, iconic characters, and of course, books. But one name in particular has become almost synonymous with sad girl literature: Sally Rooney. To anyone familiar with Sally Rooney's work, it'll probably come to no surprise that she's a Pisces. Born on February 20th, 1991 in Castlebar, County Mayo, Ireland, Rooney eventually went on to study English at Trinity College Dublin, where in 2011 she was elected as a scholar, an award considered to be the most prestigious for undergraduates in the country. Then, 2013 ended up being quite the busy year for her. She was named a top debater at the European Universities Debating Championships, graduated with her master's degree in American literature, and completed her debut novel, Conversations with Friends. Even though she wrote 100,000 words of the book in just 3 months, her first published writings would be 2 poems she submitted to the literary magazine The Stinking Fly, of which she would later become the editor. In 2015, her essay Even If You Beat Me caught the attention of literary agent Tracy Bowen. In a later interview, Rooney would say, "She had seen my story and wondered whether I had anything else she could read, but I didn't send her anything for ages. I don't know why, I just didn't want her to see this shoddy draft." Rooney eventually gave Bowen a manuscript for Conversations with Friends. Bowen circulated it to publishers, and as they say, the rest was history. It's without question that 2017 was an incredibly transformative year for Sally Rooney's career. In March 2017, Rooney published a short story titled Mr. Salary, which was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Short Story Award. And after Faber and Faber won a 7-party auction for the publishing rights, Conversations with Friends was published in the summer of 2017 in the UK and 12 other countries. It was nominated for the 2018 Swansea University International Dylan Thomas Prize, the 2018 Folio Prize, and won the 2017 Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. And in November of the same year, Rooney was named editor for the Irish literary magazine The Stinging Fly. She would only oversee the publications for 2018 before handing over editorship, but she remains a contributing editor to this day. So what was this story that caused a bidding war for a book by a debut author and would cement Rooney as a literary fixture? Well, simply put, Conversations with Friends is a story about 21-year-old college student Frances who begins an affair with the married Nick Conway. But similar to reality, it's never that simple.
People can be in love and have meaningful relationships. It's not some kind of finite resource.
Yeah, but wouldn't it depress you to sleep with someone who loves someone else?
Not if they love me too.
Set in the 2008 post-economic crash era of Dublin, Frances and Bobby are students headed into their last year of university. They have a rather complicated relationship with each other. They're best friends, exes, and slam poetry partners, Frances being the writer and Bobby the personality. After one of their performances, Frances and Bobby meet Melissa, an established author who takes a liking to the pair, particularly Bobby. When Melissa invites them over to have dinner with she and her husband Nick, the complicated entanglement of relationships amongst the foursome is set into motion. While Melissa is drawn to the freedom of the youth and budding talents, Frances and Bobby are lured by the mystique of this older and seemingly sophisticated couple. Granted, Melissa and Nick are in their early 30s and not old by any standard, but for two 21-year-old college students, early 30s would feel like a major age gap. As Bobby and Melissa seem to have an almost instant bond, Frances and Nick find themselves alone frequently, which develops the relationship sooner than it might have otherwise. But when this sudden closeness develops into an affair, Frances isn't as prepared as she thinks she is for the domino effect of complications it will bring into her life. In an interview Sally Rooney does with Mark Krasnick at the Louisiana Literature Festival, she says this.
Angular dynamic. Those 4 points, what are all the different connections that can spring up between them? And there's something almost mathematical about it, like if I move 1 point, how do all the other points move in response? How do those dynamics shift? And it felt to me, while I was writing it, that I was just really interested in that. Every time I moved one, I was interested to see how all the others moved. And every time I sort of plucked a string between 2 dynamics to hear all the other ones resonate, it was just like an interesting process for me.
I'll link the video below for anyone who's interested because this entire interview was a lot of fun to watch. But I love this description of how she played with these dynamics because that's exactly how these relationships felt. Not like it was written from a place of judgment or with the intention to promote any particular message, but rather a genuine exploration of love in all its forms. From platonic love to romantic love, to love that can't necessarily be labeled or described, but exists between people in a euphorically palpable way only to them. This must have resonated with a lot of readers because her debut exploded with commercial and critical success, landing on the New York Times bestseller list in the US and pulling a sizable fan base already. And this was just the beginning. Her sophomore novel, Normal People, hit the US shelves in 2019 as an instant New York Times bestseller, debuting at number 3 on the list. It sold 64,000 hardcover copies in the US within the first 4 months of its release. Soon, it became not only commercially successful, but critically acclaimed. In 2018, it was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won Best Novel at the Costa Book Awards. And then in 2019, it was again longlisted for the Women's Prize in Fiction and won Book of the Year at the British Book Awards. The Guardian even ranked it at number 25 on their 100 Best Books of the 21st Century list. After including it in Entertainment Weekly's Best Books of the Decade list, writer Sejo Rankin said, "Both of Sally Rooney's novels capture the millennial ethos with such raw honesty and impeccable insight, but what she broke ground with in Conversations with Friends, she perfected in Normal People." And after reading the book, it's easy to see why it's so beloved amongst casual readers and critics alike. In just about 270 pages, we follow Marianne and Connell through 4 years of their young adult life as they go from secondary school to students at Trinity College. Told through flashbacks and snippets of time between January 2011 and February of 2015, we watch them figure out what it means to love and be loved, struggle to hold on to each other in the highs and lows of their individual struggles, and ultimately discover who they are amongst the chaos of the world. I think it's easy to see a lot of yourself in both Connell and Marianne, despite probably being very different from them both. The beautiful and messy irony of the story is that Marianne and Connell are desperately searching for the answers as to why they feel so different and out of place in the world. But isn't that something we've all gone through at one point or another? So for years, Sally Rooney stans clung onto both of these novels for dear life, reading and rereading them over and over whenever they wanted to be back in the world full of characters that made them feel less alone. We waited for a new Rooney with more anticipation than Queen Charlotte does for the latest Whistledown. And like Lady Whistledown,
this author cannot keep quiet for long.
In the fall of 2021, Beautiful World Where Are You was released into the world after a summer full of hype and palpable anticipation.
But like, if my flat was burning down in a fire, my advanced reader's copy of Sally Rooney's new book is the first thing I would save.
If you were in or around the literary community at the time, you're probably familiar with the press box that our US publisher, FSG, sent around to reviewers and online book influencers that included a galley of the book, the famous yellow bucket hat, and an exclusive tote bag. For those who might not know, a galley, often called an ARC, is an advanced reader's copy. It's a bound proof of the book before final edits are complete that are used to generate advanced praise and recognition before a book's actual release. Not that Sally Rooney needed any sort of merch box to garner the attention for her new book, but it certainly helped to stir the buzz online. I also can't help but see the irony in that the book of a self-titled Marxist was promoted with trinkets that only served to commodify the status of elites of the literary community. And if that wasn't enough, the arcs for this book, one in which of the main characters, Alice, has an entire dialogue about the morality of commodifying literature and how people use and abuse the possession of literature as a status symbol, were sold for as much as $300 on eBay, despite galleys being literally valueless for resale. This is the level of fandom Sally Rooney has garnered at this point. The simple possession of owning one of the few galleys of her work was enough to cause a frenzy.
Oh my god, we're so looking forward to it. It's been 2 years since
We've
read.
gone all the way from Philosophy Bay,
Yeah,
actually.
so we can't wait.
Cuts through the rubbish, and she gets straight to the point, and she has a great understanding of inner psychology as well.
I'll be reading it on the
Yeah.
train. Yeah, it's not lasting until we get home.
I'm not going to sleep tonight.
I'm tempted to take a half day tomorrow to just finish it.
I think you should.
All right, this is it, people. Let's move. Let's go,
And in full disclosure, I am someone who does talk about books on the internet, and I almost died when I got my press box for Beautiful World Where Are You? And I'd have to agree with Jack. I'd protect my Roonies with my life. Anyways, back to what the book is all about. Beautiful World Where Are You features another ensemble of characters like we saw in Conversations with Friends, this time it being Alice, Felix, Eileen, and Simon. The synopsis states this. Alice, a novelist, meets Felix, who works in a warehouse, and asks him if he'd like to travel to Rome with her. In Dublin, her best friend Eileen is getting over a breakup and slips back into flirting with Simon, a man she's known since childhood. Alice, Felix, Eileen, and Simon are still young, but life is catching up with them. They desire each other, they delude each other, they get back together, they break apart, they have sex, they worry about sex, they worry about their friendships and the world they live in. Are they standing in the last lighted room before the darkness, bearing witness to something? Will they find a way to believe in a beautiful world? As you can probably tell by now, I'm a huge fan of Rooney and her work. I've read all of the books more than once, and they bring me to tears every time. All of that to say, this won't be a review of the books, or even a side-by-side comparison of the books versus the shows. Okay, I'll probably throw in a few storyline deviations, but overall I want to look at the two on-screen adaptations of her work and why one was a gigantic success, while the other fell pretty flat. In May of 2019, BBC Three and Hulu announced that Normal People would be adapted into a 12-part limited series that was set to be released in 2020. The show is to be directed by Irish filmmaker Lenny Abramson, most recognized for directing Room, a film based on the Emma Donoghue book of the same title, and Hetty MacDonald, director of the 2017 Hugo Award-winning episode of Doctor Who, Blink. Meanwhile, Sally Rooney herself worked on the script alongside Succession writer Alice Birch. The cast was announced shortly after that, naming Daisy Edgar-Jones and Paul Mescal as Marianne Sheridan and Connell Waldron, respectively. Immediately, the Normal People fandom online exploded. Normal People, having only been published in the previous year if you lived in the US, or 2 if you lived in the UK, had quickly developed a strong fan base in literary spaces. Following the massive success of Conversations with Friends, it was no surprise that the budding icon's next release would garner notable recognition, but this success went above and beyond. So for the next year, Rooney fans screamed into the void about their crippling need to watch the awaited visual companion to their favorite novel, critics sharpened their claws in anticipation, and innocent bystanders found themselves meandering into bookstores eager to see what all the fuss was about. And then, 2020 happened. A year unlike any most people had ever seen before, 2020 came upon us with an inescapable wave of devastation, destruction, division, and despair that swept through the globe. To start, the Australian bushfires blazed into the new year, burning 47 million acres and displacing thousands. Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gianna were tragically killed in a plane accident. Meghan and Harry left the royal family. Donald Trump was impeached and then acquitted. Harvey Weinstein was officially convicted of SA, and this all happened before the World Health Organization declared we were in a global pandemic on March 11th. And as we all know, it didn't even stop there. The pandemic triggered a global recession. George Floyd was murdered by the police on the street, and after a video of the brutal murder went viral, the largest protest in US history was ignited. Across 2,000 cities, it's estimated 15 to 26 million people participated in the US, and even more people gathered in over 60 countries internationally. Twitter was hacked in a Bitcoin scam, Maxwell was arrested, murder hornets came to the United States, an accidental detonation devastated Beirut. The first Black woman and Asian woman ran on a majority party's ticket and eventually won. Black Panther icon Chadwick Boseman died from an illness no one knew he had. Wildfires across the west coast of the states created devastation and displacement. Beloved trailblazer and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, leaving everyone in absolute terror for the legal rights of Americans across the country. Van Halen died, Biden was elected as president, and QAnon infected the political right. Jeopardy icon Alex Trebek died, and the highly debated vaccines were rolled out following FDA approval, sparking highly politicized opinions from all sides.
This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently.
I didn't just talk about the 7th level of hell that was 2020 to re-traumatize you, or myself for that matter, but I think the state of the world played a large role in the commercial success for Normal People, the show. The show was released on Hulu on April 29th, 2020, very early on in quarantine during the pandemic. We were in a place where we were still completely clueless to the long road ahead of us, but deep enough in to realize our world would never be the same, no matter what happened next. I think that in times of darkness and pain, some people, rather than finding escapism in more lighthearted subjects, often turn to things that reflect that pain in a way that separates us from it. We can see characters work through their struggles, be it interpersonal or against the world, and in doing so, we can feel more equipped to mimic that vulnerable kind of strength in our own world against our own problems. So yes, I think Normal People came at the perfect time. For the 6 hours we get to spend with Marianne and Connell, we're able to escape to a world like what used to be our own, a place pure by the absence of what was our current state of panic and misinformation. And at the same time, we watch as Connell and Marianne have to grapple with all of the same emotions and fears we're also experiencing. Anxiety, depression, uncertainty about the future and our relationships, desperately searching for a safe place and struggling with what it means to feel at home. That's not to say that I think its success rests completely on the circumstances under which it was released, but I think it definitely helped. BBC Three reported its best viewing week ever with over 16.2 million program views over the 12 episodes between April 26th and May 3rd. For scale, BBC Three received 21.8 million views that week, which is twice as many as its previously held record of 10.8 million that happened during the release of Killing Eve Season 1. Yeah, almost 75% of their views that week were from normal people alone. And by November of 2020, Normal People had become the most streamed series of the year on BBC with 62.7 million views. If you were not one of the 62.7 million viewers of the show in 2020 and still haven't watched it despite somehow managing to make it this far in the video, I'm sure by now your interest in what this show is all about has been thoroughly piqued. And the answer is quite simple. It's a show about normal people. So here's the not very brief rundown. Normal People opens to a scene of Marianne and Connell in class, with Marianne showing us exactly the kind of person she is. Self-dictated, strong, unashamed, fearless.
I wasn't aware my eyeline fell under the jurisdiction of school rules.
Tried to impress your classmates. They don't look too impressed to me.
I'm pretty sure I was just looking out the window.
Come on, Sharon. If you're staring out the window daydreaming, then you're not learning, are you, Marianne?
Don't delude yourself. I have nothing to learn from you.
I know this scene might not paint Marianne in the best light for most people, but in the book, she explains it like this. It seemed so obviously insane to her then that she should have to dress up in a costume every morning and be herded around a huge building all day, and that she wasn't even allowed to move her eyes where she wanted. Even her eye movements fell under the jurisdiction of school rules. This opening scene of the show isn't where the story starts in the book, but I love the creative direction of this choice. Not only do I love how quickly we're able to get a sense of the kind of people Connell and Marianne are, but the decision to start the story in the school, a setting which dictates a lot of who both Connell and Marianne are as people, allows for our expectations of them to be subverted until their more private moments later on. Their story, to me at least, feels quite divided into eras, so to say. The first being their last year of secondary school. Although they've known each other for years before we meet them, this era is when Marianne and Connell develop their rather casual acknowledgement of each other into a more intimate relationship, and everything that transpires between them is governed by the functions of the school. Who they are to those around them and to each other is dictated by the roles they hold in the social hierarchy of the school. Marianne being the weirdo rich girl who thinks too highly of herself and subsequently not highly enough of those around her, and Connell filling in the position for objectively attractive athletic male who's well loved by default despite his shy demeanor. Later we learn that Connell's mother, Lorraine, works for Marianne's family as a house cleaner. The fact that Marianne doesn't drive and therefore relies on Connell to pick her up from Marianne's when she's done presents a particularly unique opportunity for them to engage with one another away from the judgment of their schoolmates. After Marianne tells Connell that she likes him, he kisses her in the study of her house the next day after school. Despite clearly being interested in her, Connell seems to be concerned that getting involved with each other will complicate their social lives. In other words, his social anxiety is too much for him to want to disrupt this status quo. With Connell's dread over stirring the pot amongst his friends and Marianne's desire to do whatever she believes will make Connell happy, they agree to keep their entanglement a secret. As their sexual relationship really takes form in episode 2, so does the reality of the dichotomy between their at-school passiveness and their in-bed passion. After school one day, Marianne and Connell are in his room and the discussion of college comes up. Although Connell has said that he would be applying to school to study law, he opens up to Marianne about his doubts of going into that career. As the person who knows Connell best, Marianne suggests that he should do what he loves and study English at Trinity College, the college that Marianne plans on attending. At this, Connell makes a flippant joke about how Marianne would probably pretend not to know him if she ever saw him at Trinity. This strikes them both as painfully ironic. When Connell's friends, who often like to taunt and tease Marianne, cross a line by calling her an
Ugly, flat-chested bitch.
Anne is left to lick her own wounds in horror while Connell is frozen in silence by his own fear and anxieties, pretending not to know her. This episode deviates from what happens in the book with a seemingly small detail, but it's actually one that alters the way in which we interpret the development of the relationship massively. In the book, the tone of this scene is quite different because Connell is in the bathroom when this happens and isn't even around to witness it in the first place. So when he takes her to visit the ghost house, it's just read as the physical manifestation of how Connell is allowing Marianne into other parts of his life, even if it's still in secret. But in the show, episode 2 ends at Ghost House with Marianne making a rather vulnerable attempt to understand how she fits into Connell's life, which is a direct response to this earlier display of public rejection. And although Connell claims to care for her, this won't be the last time he betrays her for the sake of maintaining his own comfort. Episode 3 opens with Marianne heading off to the fundraising event for their school's Debs, which is pretty much Irish prom. Marianne's attendance at such social events are rare, and although she is initially enjoying herself amongst her classmates, the night takes a sharp turn when Marianne is assaulted. Connell stands up for Marianne for the first time, and although it's not towards the guy who assaulted her in the first place, it is with his friends who try to belittle her violation after the fact. On the drive home, Marianne and Connell have a conversation in which she tries to open up to him about the secret life she has in her own home. She comments on how lucky he is to have a good parent in his life and how his mother raised him well because he's kind, and kind people are rare. This is only confirmed later when they get to Connell's house and she tells him how her dad used to hit her mom. This is another deviation point from the book because when Connell asks her if he ever hit her too, she shakes her head. But in the book, her response is sometimes. This difference feels significant to me considering what's to come for Marianne, but we're not there yet. The next day at school, we see Connell have a panic attack after his friends teased him about sleeping with Marianne. They don't even really know that they're sleeping together, they're just making a joke out of him taking her home, but he has a full-on panic attack. In an effort to re-establish what he considers status quo, he asks his ex Rachel to the Debs rather than Marianne. Despite his attempts to fix things with her, Marianne stops going to school and refuses to speak to Connell again. Episode 3 ends, and so does this first era of their story together. Episode 4 ushers in the Trinity College era, keeping our focus on Connell. In fact, for the first 15 minutes or so of the episode, we only see Connell. He finds an apartment near campus, he's settling into his English classes and feeling out of place there, and he gets a job at a gas station convenience shop. It's not until fellow English student Gareth invites Connell to a party that his mom pretty much has to force him to go to that we're reintroduced to Marianne. And that's not me being dramatic. In the off-screen months between secondary school and starting at Trinity, Marianne has gone through a metamorphosis of sorts, now living in an environment that's one, away from her abusive home life, but also amongst peers who she feels more connected to. And it's in this moment when Gareth assumes he's introducing Connell to his girlfriend Marianne for the first time, and she steps out from behind a swarm of friends and admirers and meets Connell's eyes for the first time since they were in Sligo, that we see how little love has been lost between them in their absence.
You know, I did used to think that I could read your mind at times.
In bed, you mean?
Yeah. And afterwards, but I don't know, maybe that's normal.
It's not.
Connell and Marianne are now back in each other's lives, having reconciled for how they last left off. Marianne soon after breaks up with Gareth, and by the end of the episode, they're back in each other's beds.
It's not like this with other people.
I know. I think we'll be fine.
And they are, until they're not. I do want to talk about some of the major plot points in the show, but I also want to warn that in the last couple of episodes, that the tone of the show shifts significantly. Here's a trigger warning for what's to come in the second half, because it gets dark. Episode 9 in particular was really hard for me to watch. Marianne goes to Sweden for a study abroad year where, in her state of depression and self-loathing, she takes part in a sadomasochist relationship with a man named Lucas that is truly haunting to watch. Meanwhile, Connell finds out that a friend from school took his own life, which sends him into his own spiral of depression. When they eventually find themselves back in Sligo together, it's evident that they're both shells of the people they used to be. The show wraps with a bittersweet end where we see them finally in a stable and healthy relationship together, healing and feeling what true love is with one another. And sometimes really loving someone is loving yourself first.
Would you come with me? We could be there together and you could study or work and... Why?
I want to stay here. I want to live the life I'm living.
By now, you probably have a good idea of why this story captured so many people's attention. A coming-of-age tale between two fated lovers who are so layered and complex, and despite having so much love for each other, they just can't seem to find a way to keep a good thing going for too long. One thing that the show does so incredibly well is character development, but I guess it really didn't have any other option. Normal People is based on a book that substitutes the traditional format of plot-driven narrative that directs the characters for a more character-driven narrative that directs the plot. The entire show is literally Connell and Marianne, the choices they make and how that informs the world around them. And lucky for us, they're incredible characters. Of our two main characters, Marianne is the hardest to figure out. Everyone in Sligo knows the wealthy Sheridan family who lives in the beautiful white home up on the hill, but no one really knows the horrors that take place behind those walls, which is almost symbolic for Marianne herself. Her abusive alcoholic father died, leaving her emotionally broken down mother and older brother to care for her, only they don't. Her brother Alan is gradually following in the footsteps of his father, with his growing hostility towards Marianne becoming more and more violent. Living within an environment of domestic violence, be it from a partner or a family member, would cause unimaginable trauma, and that's exactly what happened to Marianne's mother. Even though her mom frequently witnesses the abuse her brother inflicts on her, she's never been able to defend herself, let alone Marianne. So, despite being a witness to her pain, she does nothing. Because of this, Marianne learns how to compartmentalize her pain and loneliness in order to present herself as a strong and self-satisfied person to the world. In secondary school, Marianne plays the role of the outcast rich girl with a particularly off-putting superiority complex. She talks down to her classmates and even her teachers, which obviously doesn't go over well.
Oh, you think you're too good for me, do you?
Yeah, pretty much.
Are you serious?
I am too good for you.
To be honest, it's almost admirable how she was able to move through high school genuinely not caring what others think or say about her. That certainly wasn't my attitude at that age. But then when we see why she had to build up that outer shell, it's actually incredibly sad. For her entire life, she's been exposed to just how cold the world can be. And what's worse, it came from inside of her home, in the place she should have felt the most safe with the people who should love her the most, and they don't. That deep level of betrayal caused her to develop this seemingly cold demeanor as a self-defense mechanism. At this time, we only really see this mask slip in her moments alone with Connell. We see how she might not care what everyone thinks, but she certainly cares what Connell thinks. She's found someone who she trusts and respects, and makes her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. So when Connell tells her that he's asked Rachel to the Debs instead of her, and those all too familiar feelings of betrayal and shame wash over her, it's heartbreaking. And our hearts break with her. As much as I love Connell as a character, this wasn't his best moment. But we'll come back to Connell a little later. The next time we see Marianne, her character has undergone a significant transformation in her time between leaving Sligo and starting college at Trinity. We see a fresh and realized version of Marianne where she's able to come into her own away from the stifling oppression of her volatile home life. She's still strong and confident, but this time we really believe it. Unfortunately, this doesn't last too long for her. There's this tragic pattern we see unfold in Marianne's life where she continually finds herself in these emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically abusive relationships. She grew up in a home riddled with abuse from her father that later was perpetrated by her brother. At Trinity, after she and Connell break up, again, she starts dating the Joffrey-esque Jamie. Even their names are a little too similar for comfort.
We're heaving and not even with Italian, it's just Asians taking photos of everything. We're literally going to go and sit in a train for 2 hours to put art through a million people's camera phones.
Yeah. God forbid you might actually encounter an Asian person, Jamie. Excuse me?
I'm just gonna go get dessert.
Though it's never stated that he's physically abusive towards her, he is certainly emotionally and mentally destructive. And in the time span of their relationship, we see the Marianne, who was thriving at college, getting reduced to a shadow of her former self, weighed down by the burden of his hand at her throat. And I mean that literally. Jamie is also the one who first introduces Marianne to sadomasochist sex, which she later asked for with Lucas in Sweden. And to be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with kinky bedroom behavior between two consenting adults. This isn't intended to shame the act in and of itself, but in Marianne's situations, it was used as a weapon to dehumanize and break her down in clearly toxic relationships. Toxic relationships she unfortunately finds herself in over and over again. Unfortunately, abuse cycles like this are far from fiction. According to the UK Office of National Statistics, more than 36% of those who experienced abuse by a family member as a child were abused by a partner as an adult. The data also shows that adults who witnessed domestic abuse as a child in their home were more likely to experience abuse by a partner as an adult. And this is the sad cycle we see Marianne in for a large part of the show. Her character is in a seemingly never-ending push and pull of being broken down and having to build herself back up. And when she can't, she puts on a brave face and faces the world anyways. Her inner picture of herself is constantly clashing with the life she has and the life she thinks she deserves to have. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, even if it looks vastly different than the way Marianne experiences it. So much of Marianne's circumstances are things that happen to her and against her, that when she tries to gain control, she sometimes makes questionable choices. And if you can't relate to that, you're lying. And I have to applaud Daisy Edgar-Jones for bringing Marianne to life in such a palpable way. I mean, I think this casting was absolute perfection, and I can't imagine anyone else doing Marianne more justice than she did. Marianne is such a layered and complex character, and Daisy Edgar-Jones plays the character with such grace and empathy, it's impossible not to root for her. But as much as I love Daisy Edgar-Jones, I mean, what a queen, I have to say Paul Mescal as Connell managed to capture my heart on a different level. While Marianne is able to hide her vulnerabilities behind a wall of strength, Precious Connell certainly can't. From the very first shot, we can see how anxious Connell is about Marianne's outburst in class, and the anxiety that Connell lives with is a major part of his character. Unlike Marianne, who can point to a catalyst for her mental health struggles, Connell's anxiety is just something he lives with. And I really appreciate this representation because anxiety and depression aren't always born out of trauma. Sometimes it's just there. Connell, coming from a modest upbringing, is just trying to make it through life as a teenager when we meet him. He's raised by his very understanding, cool mom, Lorraine. I don't know if it's a cultural difference or if Lorraine is just Ireland's Miss George, but he calls his mom by her first name and talks freely about his sex life with her, so his mom definitely has some liberal parenting style. I grew up in the South in the US to rather conservative parents, so this was definitely not the way I was raised, and I have to say I'm jealous. In the show, Connell's dad is never brought up, and he doesn't need to be. But in the book, it's explained that at a young age, Lorraine told him about how she got pregnant at 19 and that his father just isn't in the picture. And that was enough for him because Lorraine was everything he ever needed. At school, Connell is your typical attractive star athlete that everyone loves, but behind closed doors, his struggle with anxiety is more of a factor in Connell's life than anyone realizes. Remember, Lorraine is Marianne's family's house cleaner, and as a result, he knows Marianne a little more than anyone at their school realizes. Even before their relationship really evolves, Connell is unable to really even acknowledge Marianne at school, seemingly in fear of ridicule from his friends. This obviously only worsens once the relationship does go from casual to sexual. Connell is insistent on keeping the relationship so tightly under wraps, he doesn't even stand up for Marianne when his friends regularly taunt her, like the
ugly, flat-chested bitch
scene I mentioned earlier. Again, there's a seemingly small difference between the way the scene plays out in the book and on screen. In the book, not only does the scene happen off page, so we get the rather flippant recounting from Marianne, but Connell isn't even present when it happens. However, in the show, Connell sits silently as his friends publicly berate Marianne, ultimately saying nothing. And it's not like Marianne is helpless in the situation. As a matter of fact, she holds her own in this verbal sparring, but it's obvious she feels hurt by his silence. On Connell's end, he is visibly shaken with anxiety, not only over the confrontation, but with the responsibility to stand up against his friends and disavow their behavior. While it would be completely fair to think that his lack of action here is inexcusable, I think it's important to point out how this highlights the extent to which he's really struggling with this state of anxiousness. This is definitely not his best moment, but it's moments like these in a story that help shape a character and their development overall, which is exactly what happens the next time Connell's in a position to defend Marianne around his friends. At a school fundraiser, Marianne is blatantly assaulted by an older friend of the group, and when some of his friends try to downplay the situation to undermine the extremely valid reason that Marianne is upset, Connell nips it in the bud and makes sure she gets home safe. Well, make sure she gets to his house safely. I mean, most people would probably feel like this is the bare minimum he could offer her as someone who loves and cares about her, but put into perspective, this is a big step for him. He puts his own discomfort and fear of rejection aside to prioritize her well-being. But as we all know, progress isn't linear, and Connell soon falls back into his need for comfort. After having a panic attack at school, triggered by his friends teasing him about Marianne, Connell asks Rachel to the Debs. And if you're like me and wish you could smack some sense into Connell, for lack of a better word, at this moment, don't you worry. Good old Lorraine has our back.
You're fucking her and you wouldn't even say hello to her in public.
It's not like that you're twisting it now.
What are you afraid of? What people would think of you if they find out you liked her. I tell you what I think of you. I think you're a disgrace. And I'm ashamed of you.
Where are you going?
I'll get the bus home.
What are you talking about? Will you act normal, will you?
If I stay in the car, I'll only say things I regret.
Matt!
Unfortunately, this doesn't make Connell change his mind about taking Rachel to the Debs, but sometimes people have to learn things in their own way. After Marianne decides to end things, completely cutting Connell out of her life, he realizes his mistakes a little too late.
Hey, it's me again. I know it's late to be calling and all that, I know you probably don't want to talk to me or anything, but I was just calling to say that I miss you. See, I can't really talk to anybody the way that I talk to you or anything like that. And I don't really know what to say other than the fact that I miss you, and I really love you, Marianne, and yeah, I'm sorry.
Throughout his time at Trinity, free from the burden of what people expected from him in Sligo, we see Connell come into his own, like Marianne did. Connell, king of the introverts, eventually finds his place once Marianne's friend group adopts him into their group as one of their own. It's genuinely nice to see him at peace during this time as he thrives in his classes and he and Marianne are finally happy together for a little bit. Unlike Marianne, Connell doesn't come from money and has to work to pay his way through college. So when he loses his job over the summer and can no longer afford rent, it's a catalyst to the most frustrating moment of miscommunication in the entire series. Connell is hesitant to ask Marianne to stay with her over the summer. It's a concoction of fear of rejection and not wanting to feel needy or dependent, and of course his general state of anxiety. So when he tells Marianne about his situation, he's immediately hurt when she doesn't offer for him to stay with her. I guess as a way to save face from embarrassment, he says,
I guess you want to see other people.
And Marianne says,
I guess so.
From her perspective, Connell has just told her that he'll be moving back to Sligo for the summer and then proposes they see other people. So from her vantage point, he's breaking up with her, understandably. Later on, they talk about this moment, but it's a little too late.
You said you wanted to see other people. I thought you were breaking up with me. You never said anything about wanting to stay here. That would have been... always. Obviously.
I will say that I really appreciate how they didn't go for a more blatant miscommunication trope, and instead actually incorporated this character development. Connell's anxiety prevented him from being able to ask Marianne directly for what he wanted, and Marianne, primed to expect the worst, read the situation like a breakup. It's incredibly frustrating to watch because you just want them to communicate properly and be happy together. I would be lying if I said I didn't eat up this storytelling. I think it's super cool how we get to see both Connell and Marianne's perspectives on screen. In Marianne's perspective, Connell is matter-of-fact about the situation while she stands frozen in her sudden heartache. But from Connell's vantage point, he came to her with an open heart and she dismissed him. It's an interesting reminder to how we all experience life with a clouded perspective from our own biases and dispositions, and people aren't mind readers. But back to Connell. Towards the end of the show, we see a major turning point in Connell's life when his school friend Rob commits suicide. He falls into a major depression, feeling guilt and grief, confusion and despair. It's honestly heartbreaking to watch, mostly thanks to Paul Mescal's incredible acting. I mean, for his role as Connell, he was nominated for 4 Best Actor awards and won at the British Academy Television Awards for a reason. After reading the book, I related so heavily to Connell and his internal struggles, and the show only amplified that for me. And yes, I'm simping here because there's nothing better than watching a character that feels so personal to you be played to perfection, and by a gorgeous actor, no less. When I look at Marianne's overall character arc, she starts as a deeply troubled teenager who puts on a front of strength, and by the end of the story, she's still a troubled young adult who has learned to persist with a true inner strength. But Connell's a little different. Through his struggles of anxiety and depression, Connell is constantly searching for normalcy, to be seen as normal and ultimately feel normal. He thinks that his struggles are what makes him unnormal, and at every turn tries desperately to suppress them in favor of being like everyone else. So we get to see him go from this anxiety-ridden teen to a similarly anxious young adult who's just a little less concerned about fitting into a box of normal. It's not a perfect swing into happily ever after, but it's real. In the end, these characters come together to tell a story that is overwhelmingly human. I'm a big reader in my spare time, and I've always been most drawn to stories that capture how messy and complex and beautiful people can be, even in a life that seems rather mundane on the surface. That's why I love Sally Rooney and her characters so much. I think most people can watch Marianne and Connell and relate to them in a way that transcends their particular circumstance because it speaks to the human experience. Lucky for us, normal people, the show is the poster child for how to adapt a story for the screen in a way that only enhances the original essence of the characters. Unfortunately for us, that luck would run thin with the next installment of the Sally Rooney cinematic universe. In February of 2020, before Normal People had even been released into the world, BBC and Hulu announced that they would also be taking on Sally Rooney's debut work for adaptation. Of course, they had no idea at the time that just a month later, the world would shut down and begin its descent in the never-ending pit of what was shaping up to be the year from... We all lived through 2020. You were there, you know what happened. Needless to say, production for Conversations with Friends was delayed like literally everything else that year. So it wasn't until February of 2021 that the casting would finally be announced. It's undeniable that the performance of Normal People, which exceeded all expectations, paved the way and readied the anticipation for Conversations with Friends. I mean, yes, the show was announced before we even knew what a massive success Normal People would turn out to be, but I think that probably helped save it from becoming a 2020 graveyard project. And in their efforts to rebound from this delay and add on to the ever-growing love of the SRU this time, BBC and Hulu had two secret extra weapons in their back pockets: Phoebe Bridgers and Joe Alwyn. There's actually this really weird crossover extra bit of information between Normal People and Conversations with Friends. Aside from both being the adapted brainchildren of a literary icon, Conversations with Friends featured an exclusive song from idol Phoebe Bridgers, who was dating Normal People dreamboat Paul Mescal. Meanwhile, the other Normal People star, Daisy Edgar Jones, is set to headline in the film Where the Crawdads Sing, adapted from the internationally best-selling book of the same title, a movie that will be featuring a song from the not very well-known and small indie singer Taylor Swift, who is long-term partners with Conversations with Friends star Joe Alwyn. I don't really know what to do with that, I just thought it was interesting. Anyways, I don't actually think that Joe Alwyn was cast as Nick in some nepotist plot to manipulate the Taylor Swift fandom into skyrocketing the success of the show, but when the casting was announced, people had thoughts. Aside from Alison Oliver, who seemed as good as any other mousy brunette to play a Sally Rooney lead, people seemed to find reasons to question the decisions behind the casting of the other three lead roles. From hating friend of Lena Dunham, Jemima Kirk, to not appreciating that a Black American woman was cast to play an originally white Irish woman, to I just don't see him as Nick, Joe Alwyn. Eyebrows were raising across the internet. Now, don't get me wrong, buzz and excitement was not lacking leading up to its release. But clearly Normal People and its phenomenally exceptional casting had set a bar that Conversations with Friends was now inevitably being set up against. So with the casting set, we waited, hoping for all our doubts to be proven wrong and Conversations with Friends to come with an even bigger bang than its predecessor. And finally, May 15th, 2022 came around and we all got to see Lenny Abramson's latest masterpiece. And it was a show. Before we dive into the show itself, let's address the elephant in the room. On the surface, this is a story about an affair. I know a lot of people have many opinions on the depiction of cheating in media, and while you are of course entitled to those convictions, I think the story has a lot to offer past that. At its heart, it reflects on the complicated ways in which people can find and have love, and all its inevitable ripple effects. Yes, the relationship between Frances and Nick is certainly romanticized, as in the romance is depicted, but I don't think the story glorifies cheating. In fact, I think it does the exact opposite, as it doesn't shy away from exploring the very real hurt that kind of betrayal of trust can cause everyone involved. Basically, if cheating is a no-go for you under any circumstance, this isn't going to be the story for you. And that's okay. Conversations with Friends, Episode 1, opens to Frances and Bobby ending their junior year of college, finishing up finals, and getting ready for their summer. Like normal people, we get this immediate setup for our two main characters and their dynamic. As they sit on the sidewalk, we can tell immediately that Bobby is a dominant and extroverted personality, while Frances is more meek and subtle in her expression. It's a very direct and seemingly manufactured way to communicate it to the audience, but effective nonetheless. This is only further built upon after Frances and Bobby perform their poetry at a club and they meet Melissa, who is a successful writer. Bobby is very bold and open about establishing a rapport with Melissa, while Frances literally fades into the background. Bobby tells Melissa about how within their poetry partnership, Frances is the writer and she's the personality, and then proceeds to tell Melissa, and of course the audience, that
We were fucking back then too, but we don't do that anymore. We dropped the fucking but kept the poetry.
if you're a chronic introvert like myself, personalities like Bobby's can come off as abrasive and exhausting, which is exactly how I felt after watching this scene. No shade to all the bold extroverts out there, she just seems like a lot. Nonetheless, her tactics work and Melissa invites them over for dinner after a swim. And then we meet Nick, Melissa's actor husband. When Nick and Frances first meet, they have this moment where I think we're supposed to feel this instant connection between the two, but it comes off more like two shy people having an awkward first meeting. And it only continues into the group's super awkward dinner. It's actually funny how Bobby and Melissa literally carry the conversation on their backs, while Frances and Nick mostly offer up weird smiles and the occasional one-worder.
Yeah.
Hi. Did you like it?
Yeah, I loved it.
Do you feel possible?
And I sound like I'm kind of bagging on them, and in a way, you'd be right, but I really do think they have some charming moments. I just think their dynamic is quite different from the book, where they came off as mild-mannered people of few words, rather than super awkward introverts. But I'll come back to this later. Frances ends up going to see Nick's play later in the episode, and when she texts him to congratulate him on the show, it officially marks the beginning of their relationship. We also see the first signs of Frances' struggles with what she thinks is just period pain, attempting to soothe herself with a hot water bottle and painkillers. The episode ends with Nick and Melissa coming to one of Bobby and Frances' poetry shows, and Frances and Nick actually share a sweet moment. It's rather mundane and, dare I say, boring conversation they have, but for some reason I found myself smiling through it. There's something definitely charming about their weird and awkward way of being with one another that's endearing to watch. Episode 2 opens with Melissa's famous birthday party, where Nick and Frances' relationship goes from innocent glances and soft smiles to physical. Both looking for some quiet away from the party, they find themselves alone for the first time.
Cheeks are red. Only slightly.
It's warm.
Try this.
That's so good.
Frances rushes to leave after this once it hits her that she's just kissed her new friend's husband, and on her birthday no less. The next morning she heads to her mom's, and this is the first time we get to see what her relationship is like with her parents. Believe it or not, Frances is just as awkward with her mom and dad as she is with everyone else. It's hard to read what exactly her relationship is with her mom from these scenes, but it's clear there's a big tonal shift between what she's like with her mom and with her dad. In the book, we're told that her dad is an alcoholic, but in this episode, it's not completely evident that's the case. Nonetheless, the discomfort she feels being at her father's is visible. When Frances returns to Dublin, Bobby confronts her about why she left the party so early, and then drops the news that she kissed Melissa that night. Of course, this would be the perfect time for Frances to share her own kiss with the other half of that married couple, but she doesn't.
Me kissing a married woman.
I don't disapprove.
Frances and Nick end up running into each other, and by running into each other, I mean Bobby dragged her to the event so she could see Melissa at a book reading. Still feeling weird about their secret kiss, they make plans to meet up and talk later. And later comes sooner than expected when Nick invites her over after Melissa leaves town for work in London that evening. Again, Frances has a chance to tell Bobby about what's happening with her and Nick, but again chooses not to. Once at Nick's, Frances tells him that she doesn't want to be a homewrecker and hurt his marriage. And Nick fills her in on the already damaged state of their relationship. With that, they feel morally in the clear to explore their feelings for one another, and so the affair officially begins. But make no mistake, they're still super awkward together. After blowing her off for Nick, Frances reaches out to Bobby to make it up to her with food and a movie, but then it kind of blows up in her face when the movie Bobby picks is one of Nick's. And things between them get interesting.
Are you jealous? Is that it?
This is just one of the many tiffs Frances and Bobby have over the course of the show, and after Bobby does a little ranting about gender politics, apologies are made and they kiss and make up. Meanwhile, Nick ends up having to leave Dublin for the rest of the summer, partly for work and then for his planned summer holiday in Croatia with his wife. This clearly leaves Frances in an emotionally vulnerable position as she questions what the relationship will look like after the summer. We'll come back to this too. Later on in the episode, Frances gets particularly uncomfortable when a coffee date with Bobby turns into a coffee date with Bobby and Melissa, being that she's having an affair with her husband. But much to her surprise, Melissa offers for Frances and Bobby to join her and Nick on their summer holiday. Despite her many attempts to get out of it, Bobby eventually wears Frances down on the subject. And I have to say, Croatia is absolutely beautiful. It's not a place I really had on my radar to travel to before, but it's certainly on my list now. But for our characters, Croatia is no holiday away from their mess. In fact, it manages to only heighten the complex dynamics between everyone. Frances finds out about Nick's experience with depression in a rather unempathetic way. Melissa all but outright accuses Frances of having an affair with Nick. Frances and Bobby continue to bump heads over what Bobby calls her little crush on Nick, and despite Frances having really complicated feelings about hearing Nick say that he still loves Melissa, she and him are simply unable to control their sexual desires for one another, and so the only solution is for Nick to start slipping into Frances's room late at night for some fun that is both risky and risque. And it's all working out great until Bobby walks in on them. And that's how episode 4 of this 12-part series ends. Rest assured, quiet chaos and complicated dynamics continue to unfold over the next 4 hours of the show, but I want to shift more to a character analysis. As you can certainly tell by now, Conversations with Friends is a messy exploration of what love is and its impact between 4 very flawed people who are just doing their best to figure it out, despite their best not always being very great. You've probably noticed that theme in Sally Rooney's work. Her stories often seek to question and meditate on the basic qualities of the human experience. And when your work is so heavily focused on the emotional journey of your characters, rather than any substantial plot points to drive the story, the quality of those characters and the function of their development become uncompromisingly the key to successful storytelling. One of the main issues then with this adaptation, at least for me, isn't that these are bad characters, but their development and interpersonal dynamics are communicated in such a muddy way. Let me explain. Frances is a person who lives a lot of her life stuck in her own head. Compared to other Rooney characters, like Marianne for example, a lot of what characterizes Frances are internal struggles. She and Bobby have this conversation in Croatia where Bobby suggests that Frances hides herself and her emotions away rather than expressing them. a conclusion she comes to based on Frances's lack of appropriate emotional expression, according to Bobby. But Frances counters this, explaining that she's not hiding her emotions, she just doesn't feel strongly moved about most things to have any particular emotions to express. She's quiet and shy, and in her own words describes herself as just not feeling a lot of emotions to share in the first place. But as we quickly find out, that's not entirely accurate. Frances's major conflict is within herself, and her ability, or lack thereof, to recognize and acknowledge herself. Her problem isn't so much that she doesn't have emotional experiences, but rather she doesn't know how to confront and process them, so she disregards it instead. And I have to say, I relate to Frances so much with this. Sometimes I just feel things and I don't know what to make of it, and then I question if I'm even valid in feeling those things, so it's easier to push it aside than to work through it. It comes back to a root issue of insecurity in who you are, and we see this theme surface with Frances repeatedly throughout the show. In the first episode of the show at dinner, Melissa asks Frances about her writing and why she does stand-up poetry.
I like the impermanence of it, like the performance thing. I feel a bit sick when I think about it lasting forever.
That's so funny because I always thought of writing as about some sort of desire for permanence. I feel like when I'm writing, I'm trying to get clarity, and then when I do, I want to keep it.
No, I think I'm trying for that, but it just doesn't feel possible.
I think that's quite telling of how Frances sees and deals with her feelings overall. She feels incapable of reaching this supposed destination of clarity. I'll talk about this in a little more depth later, but I think it's interesting to note that in the book, this problem feels significantly different to us as the reader. In the book, Frances is our narrator, and as a result, we are literally existing in her head. So even though we can see how her struggle to process her emotions impacts her relationships, we get the rare vantage point of having this world filtered through her thoughts and consequentially her emotions. And translating the story from page to screen, we no longer have this unfettered access to her inner dialogue as an audience. So decoding Frances's behavior and her actions require a little more reading between the lines.
What? You're thinking things and not saying them. It's suspicious.
Most of Frances's story and thus characterization is set within the push and pull of her relationships with both Nick and Bobby. Again, in the beginning, we get a good idea of what the dynamic of Frances and Bobby's relationship is. Frances feels overshadowed by Bobby, both around other people and privately. I don't think it's an actual power imbalance, I don't think Bobby is consciously overpowering her, but Frances feels almost undeserving of her attention and love.
I wasn't popular, but she chose me anyway. Sort of changed my life, if I think about it.
And then Frances meets Nick, and there's a notable difference between her dynamic with him in comparison to Bobby, almost like there's a level playing field with their very similar personalities. Although she feels seen by Nick in many ways, she also feels like his feelings for her take a back seat to his feelings for his wife, which makes sense. So, within both of these relationships, Frances is dealing with feeling overshadowed, and although it's expressed differently, it's present nonetheless. And then, amongst all of that, there's an added layer of complexity as Frances struggles to find a balance in her life for her time with Bobby and her relationship with Nick. We first see Frances and Bobby's paths start to diverge almost immediately after meeting the couple. Bobby's infatuation with Melissa only continues to grow as they spend more time with her, and at the same time, she's not shy about her disdain for Nick. On several occasions, Bobby talks about how she can't believe Melissa and Nick are married because she's so interesting and Nick is so boring. So while Frances and Nick become increasingly close, it makes it even harder for her to be open with Bobby about her feelings for him. This impacts Frances on two levels. So not only does Bobby belittle the idea of Nick being a person someone could be attracted to, but she also disregards him as an uninteresting person. something that Frances sees herself as. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that Frances probably sees a lot of her own dynamic with Bobby in Melissa and Nick's relationship. Bobby and Melissa are both open and interesting people that seem to attract friends and admirers wherever they go, while Nick and Frances are their lesser counterparts that could be deemed as unworthy of their attention. And this, of course, deepens not only Frances's feelings of invalidation with respect to her relationship with Bobby, but also connects her to Nick in what she views as their shortcomings. So once Frances and Nick start their affair, it's no wonder she chooses to keep it a secret instead of being honest about it with Bobby. We first see this play out in episode 2, when Frances invites Bobby to hang out with her after her first meetup with Nick. Bobby wants to watch one of Nick's old movies, and Frances is adamantly against it. Bobby teases her a little for her crush on Nick, and Frances, feeling insecure and wanting to regain control of the situation, accuses Bobby of being jealous. This is the first Nick-centered tension that we see between them, but it certainly won't be the last. Meanwhile, Frances and Nick continue to see each other, growing closer in their relationship. But when Nick tells her that he'll be leaving Dublin for the rest of the summer, we see her insecurities with him come up as well. This leads to them not talking for a few weeks, allowing she and Bobby to reestablish their state of normalcy with each other, until Melissa invites them on holiday. In Croatia, things for Frances become even more complicated. She and Nick continue their affair while tensions with Bobby rise from her continued teasing of Frances's crush on him. Things come to a head when Bobby walks in on Frances and Nick in bed together on their last night. This of course upsets Bobby, not because her best friend is having an affair with her new favorite person's husband, but because she feels left out of Frances's life. From here, Frances's relationships with Bobby and Nick become a rapidly swinging pendulum, constantly going from good to bad to worse. Eventually, Bobby moves into Frances's spare room, and for a short time, Frances manages to find peace and balance between being with Bobby and still seeing Nick. But then Frances, feeling jealous and insecure when Bobby brings another woman home after a night out, goes on a Tinder date that she later tells Nick about. This obviously hurts him, and they stop talking for a while, until Frances has a health scare and Bobby invites him over to comfort her and they get back together. But as you probably guessed by now, this doesn't last long either, because when Nick tells her that he recently slept with his wife, Melissa, Frances is overcome by all of those familiar feelings of jealousy and insecurity, and they once again break up. At the same time, Bobby finds out that Frances wrote and published a rather personal short story about her, which, you guessed it, causes a fight between them. Bobby even says that she doesn't want to be Frances's friend anymore, but they predictably work it out and go back to being best friends. Yeah, I'm exhausted too. In the last episode, things more or less go back to how they started. Melissa and Nick stay together, having faded out of Bobby and Frances's lives, until an unexpected call from Nick draws Frances right back in. The point amongst all of this is that Frances's development as a character is inextricably linked to her relationships with Nick and Bobby, and there's really no room to look at it any other way.
I do believe that people can change each I believe people don't have any choice but to change each other. There is no you without others. I mean, there's no version of yourself that isn't constantly influenced by everybody else in your life. I mean, even the fact that we use language is obviously, it's a human invention and we got it from other people. We didn't invent it for ourselves. So everything we know about ourselves comes from other people telling us and showing us. So I don't believe there's any such thing as the individual unit that just moves through the world unaffected by other things.
And we see this truth play out within the dynamics of all four characters, but the illustration is commandingly evident when we look at Frances. Another major part of Frances's development is her experience and diagnosis of endometriosis. Throughout the entire series, even before she's diagnosed, we see her struggle with these severe period pains. She's constantly soothing herself with hot water bottles and even wakes up on the bathroom floor after a particularly difficult spell of pain. It comes to a head when she's at her mother's following the trip to Croatia. She's not only feeling sick from her period, but she's lost more blood than what's typical. Initially, the doctors think she might be having a miscarriage, and I don't really think I even have to explain why that would be such a heavy thing to process for her. Ultimately, she was not having a miscarriage and was never even pregnant, but that would still be a complex experience to recover from. After several hospital visits and multiple tests, she's given her diagnosis. According to the World Health Organization, endometriosis is a disease where tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside of the uterus, to put it simply. Endometriosis affects roughly 10% of reproductive age women and girls globally. That's 190 million women. A study done by Dr. Malcolm McKenzie and Dr. Celeste Royce explains that endometriosis is so hard to diagnose because not only are the symptoms incredibly variable, but pains that are often chalked up to period pains aren't always seen as serious, both by doctors and patients themselves. And we see this to be true with Frances. Even after she's diagnosed, she's hesitant to tell the people in her life, still unsure about her own feelings surrounding it. On one hand, she doesn't want it to become a thing in her life, for her friends and family to look at her differently or treat her like she's a sick person. But at the same time, it has become a thing for her in her own head. When she goes to the hospital and is told that she might have had a miscarriage, it's the first time she's confronted the very real possibility of her being or getting pregnant. Nick is the first man Frances has ever been with, so the reality of the situation kicks in for her, and as you would imagine, it's overwhelming. Maybe kids aren't what she wants immediately, but the news that fertility could be an issue for her moving forward is a hard thing for her to grapple with, understandably so. This goes back to Frances's struggle with her own perception of who she is. In Frances's eyes, she's the daughter of an alcoholic, a mistress, a shadow to her brighter second half, and now she feels like amongst all of that, her body has turned against her, and she doesn't quite know how to make sense of it yet.
I don't know, Bobby. What are you even allowed to feel about something that probably wasn't anything?
I think the biggest turning point for Frances and her development comes during her confrontation with Melissa for showing Bobby the short story she wrote. She accuses Melissa of showing Bobby the story as an attempt to hurt her, and while Melissa denies this, she takes the opportunity to tell Frances the reality of her situation.
Impact. Your writing has impact. The way you have behaved has had real consequences.
I think this is genuinely the first time Frances truly recognizes this. It's something that seems like it would be so evident and inescapable to most people, but that's something that has been noticeably lacking in how Frances views herself in the world. Frances doesn't even take the time to acknowledge the impact her own actions and emotions have on herself, let alone the people around her. To her, the actions and therefore impact are as insignificant as she feels she is. In a review for the book, Alexandra Shorts for The New Yorker wrote this: "Her affair with Nick is an expression of exquisite compulsive selfishness. Never before has she had so little control over herself and so much over another person, a disturbing truth that she does her best to ignore. Among the novel's bittersweet ironies is that, for all Frances's suspicion of cliché, she can't shake her sense that Nick, as a handsome older man, will behave according to type, discarding her as soon as he's bored or sated. Actually, he's touchingly tender and open-hearted, as fragile in his way as Frances is in hers. He's been hospitalized for depression. Melissa handles him with an infantilizing mixture of indulgence and contempt that disgusts Frances, and yet she herself treats Nick callously, abusing her emotional and erotic power over him precisely because she refuses to believe that she could have any. So this hard truth from Melissa is the much-needed wake-up for her to make the strides towards personal responsibility and making amends. In the last scene of the final episode, Nick accidentally calls Frances thinking he was calling his wife. They end up talking for a long time, catching each other up on what's happened in their lives in the months they haven't spoken. Frances tells him that she and Bobby are back together and about her diagnosis. She's honest about her fears and insecurities about it and how those feelings impacted their relationship. She's able to openly and securely talk about these things that were nearly impossible for her to even reconcile within herself. The moment is brief, but we're able to walk away feeling hopeful and maybe even happy for Frances. Side by side, Bobby and Frances seem to have polar opposite personalities. Frances is a quiet, self-conscious person who feels more comfortable expressing herself in mediums that aren't face-to-face interactions, while Bobby is boisterous and unabashedly herself, no matter the circumstance. She could care less who she's speaking to or how what she's saying will be interpreted. Bobby is ready and willing to tell you exactly what she's thinking. If she were a real person, she'd be the poster child for progressive millennial stereotypes.
Don't you feel a bit conflicted?
Just generally, or
You're playing a gay character and you're a straight man.
is Brick gay? Bisexual, maybe.
Make it sound like gay is the destination and bisexual is like a stop on the way. Not quite there. I mean, Frances is bisexual.
Jesus
so
Christ,
you've
Bobby.
probably totally offended her.
I promise I feel very conflicted, Bobby.
Okay.
I apologise.
Well, as long as you're self-flagellating and having an awful time.
But beneath that strong and self-assured outer shell, Bobby is actually quite soft and emotional. She cares fiercely for those around her, and as much as she offers herself as an open book, she desires that same level of vulnerability in return. Something she doesn't get often from Frances, and it's at the root of most of their problems. From keeping her relationship with Nick a secret to writing a short story about the intimate and unbalanced way she sees her, Frances frequently fails to communicate directly with Bobby, which is at odds with how she believes relationships should function. But despite the many fights she and Frances get into, it's clear that she makes a genuine effort to meet Frances where she is, even when it hurts her. For example, when Frances collapses in the rain, a symptom of her yet-to-be diagnosed endometriosis, Bobby spends the day caring for her and making sure she's okay. She takes her home and helps her get out of her wet clothes. She runs a bath and stays by her side while Frances tells her about the problems she's having with Nick. Even though Frances's relationship with Nick has caused their own relationship so much strife, she goes out of her way to reach out to Nick so he can comfort her in her time of need.
I knew I could be so nurturing. I did.
Aside from Frances, Bobby's unrelenting infatuation with Melissa is a secondary character trait. It's never really made clear why she likes Melissa so much. Maybe it's the draw of Melissa being this older, conventionally successful woman, or maybe it's as simple as her attraction to her. Either way, it clearly contributes to the rift that forms between her and Frances throughout the show. We don't get to see a lot of Bobby's life outside of the confines of the main characters, other than the occasional mention of how she's struggling with her parents' recent separation. And unlike Frances, her character doesn't go through any particular arc of development. The Bobby we see in the beginning is pretty much who she is by the end of the show. Even though Nick and Melissa are major parts of the dynamic of the story, it's a shame that we also don't get to see a lot of development in their characters. Of all of the four main characters, Melissa is the hidden gem. She probably has the least romanticized role as Nick's less than innocent wife and the direct foil to Frances, but her character really has so much to offer. Melissa meets Frances and Bobby after their poetry show, and I think she was genuinely drawn to and inspired by the young fellow creatives who were out there sharing their craft. Aside from being the catalyst for how Nick and Frances formed their relationship, Melissa doesn't have a huge role in the show, but when she is present, it's undeniably impactful. She's always around to embrace Frances and Bobby in her life, inviting them to events, and of course, on the infamous holiday in Croatia. But her character development really comes to a head around episode 10 when she finds out about Frances's relationship with her husband Nick. I think we would all be very understanding if Melissa, after inviting Frances into her home and her life with open arms, lost it over this betrayal. But surprisingly, she doesn't.
Out a way to make it work between us. 3 of us. I don't know, maybe we could all have dinner.
Instead, she does the hard thing and actually takes the time to try to understand Frances and Nick's relationship. She loves Nick, and even though it must hurt her to see him so happy with this woman who she brought into their lives, her love for him comes first. Not only does she allow Nick to fully explore what this new connection with Frances fully means to him, but she even puts forth a genuine effort to find a way to make this new 3-person dynamic work. There's no doubt that she and Nick have a rather complicated and strained marriage. She's cheated on him, seemingly multiple times. When Nick was most in need of support, she wasn't in a place to give that to him. They don't seem to be on the same page about wanting children, and they even narrowly avoided getting divorced. But even all of that doesn't negate the love that still exists between the two. I really appreciate the space for nuance that's allowed to develop within this relationship. I think it's so easy to look at a dynamic like this and write it off as one thing or another, but in reality, life exists in the gray. It's messy and layered, and many things can be true at once, even when it seems conflicting. My favorite moment for Melissa is her phone call with Frances in episode 12. Frances calls her upset and accuses her of intentionally trying to hurt her by showing Bobby her story. She, rightfully so, has some choice words for her.
But you took every opportunity to make me feel pathetic and conventional. Writing for money, having a husband, instead of fucking someone else's
Everything
husband.
was about Nick. It wasn't about you.
He's my husband! I am part of it!
But in the end, despite the fact that the woman who's been sleeping with her husband called her to yell at her and then started crying when she felt hurt by her words, she takes a second to put her feelings aside and make sure she's okay. And I think that illustrates her character perfectly. She's flawed, just like everyone else, but she's also patient and compassionate through it all. Nick is a soft and sensitive soul who I think has found himself in the incredibly complicated position of being in love with 2 people at the same time. Although his love for Frances and Melissa are different, the love is real nonetheless. His personality is actually very similar to Frances. His biggest obstacle is himself, more specifically being an advocate for himself. When he was in the hospital for his depression and Melissa cheated on him, he actually apologized to her for not being around, at least according to the book. It's a hard balance to strike between wanting to cater to the people you love and still needing to be honest to yourself. Nick's inability or hesitations to communicate in a vulnerable way is a big reason why he and Frances have such an emotionally unstable relationship. Whenever there's a time he has to be honest about how he's feeling face to face, he crumbles instead. We see this after they first kiss at Melissa's party, when he leaves for the summer and doesn't really know how to talk to Frances about the state of their relationship, and especially in the fight they have after Frances tells him about her Tinder date. That's not to say he doesn't have moments of being able to communicate his vulnerabilities with Frances, because he does, but they're very far and few between. One of those moments is the last scene of the show, when he and Frances truly open themselves up to one another, and it's clear that through it all, their love hasn't faded.
Melissa's birthday after we kissed.
Yeah.
I stayed in my room and I waited for you for hours. I felt paralysed by the idea that you were close by and that you might come back. I have reckless impulse to be available to you.
You've probably been able to pick up on the fact that I have a few issues with Conversations with Friends, the show. I don't think it's a bad show, at all, but in many ways it didn't live up to my expectations. Book to screen adaptations can be difficult to execute successfully, and I think some of my issues stem from that. For one, the book is written from the perspective of Frances, with a lot of internal dialogue and written conversations between the friends. I think that we can all agree that Frances makes many questionable decisions throughout the story, but the formatting allows you to get a better understanding of why she does what she does. And of course, understanding why someone has made a decision doesn't excuse or justify it, but it offers up the ability for us as the audience to both sympathize and empathize with her as a complex and flawed human. For example, when Frances finds out that she has endometriosis, we're able to follow along as she grapples with her feelings on chronic illness. We see how she struggles with feelings of brokenness and potential infertility, with not wanting the people she loves to see her as weak or needy, but also actively feeling emotionally and physically weak and in need of support. So then, when we see her pushing away those close to her, hiding her diagnosis and struggling with how it's changed her own perception of herself, we get it. Although Frances is obviously the main character, being a witness to the story outside of her head, and therefore without the context of her thoughts, adds a neutrality to the storyline that is less present in the book. However, the show doesn't do the best job of filling in those gaps. There is a lot of dead air in the show, which isn't inherently a bad thing. I can appreciate slow stories with minimal dialogue that allow the audience time to reflect and ponder on the themes and conflicts at play. And while this story is the perfect instigator for long discussions and debates on moral positionings, it's also boring. You have no idea how much it pains me to say that. Conversations with Friends is one of my favorite books, and after watching Normal People, I had such high hopes for this to be my new favorite series. But even as someone who's read the book too many times and came into the show with all of the context of the storyline to feel invested in these characters, I just didn't. And despite about 50% of the show being sad music playing over pleasant street views or conflicted stares, what I think I disliked the most was the pacing of the show. This is a 12-part series, each episode running at about 30 minutes each. But somehow this 6-hour show ends up feeling like 12 hours. And not in a good way, where you're so invested and engaged you just don't want it to end, but more in a, I can't believe we're not even halfway through this episode yet kind of way. In the first 5 episodes of the show, it feels like so much happens. We see Bobby and Frances make friends with this new couple, Frances and Nick start seeing each other, they go away to Croatia, the affair blows up in Frances's face. For those first 5 episodes, despite still having that stylistically slow, melodic pacing, it feels like enough is happening to be engaging. Relationships are forming and evolving, there's a refreshing change of setting, there's an element of tension with Nick and Frances's secret relationship. It just feels impactful. But after that, there's this tangible lull in the storytelling, and there shouldn't be because a lot happens in those episodes too. Frances ends up in the hospital after a health scare and later gets her diagnosis. Bobby moves in with her. Frances publishes her first piece of writing, which later blows up in her face with Nick. Nick tells Melissa about his affair, and then Melissa confronts Frances about it. Frances's dad, who's an alcoholic, goes through a particularly difficult time, which makes her worry for his well-being. And of course, there's plenty of fighting and making up along the way. But for some reason, when you're watching it, it's so slow and dull that it almost feels like nothing is happening. And then in wrapping everything up in the last episode, the pace picks back up and you're invested again, but by that time, it's over. Now, maybe it's just me, and other people didn't feel like that while watching it, but it just felt so unbalanced. If I'm being completely honest, if this wasn't a show based on my favorite book, and I didn't come into it with a vested interest in seeing it through, this probably would have been another show that ended up in my continue watching graveyard. And it's a shame, because I genuinely think the story is so good, and the show still has a lot to offer. It just felt so boring. At the time of writing this, the show has only been out for just about a month, so I don't know what the viewership was like, or if it will receive any critical acclaim like Normal People did. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I had to watch the show a few times while putting this video together, and I can't tell if I like it more or less after the fact. While it helped me appreciate the slighter nuances of how the story was told, I also hated having to wade through every slow shot with melodic music and minimal dialogue that takes up the majority of the runtime. My feelings on the show overall are obviously conflicted, but I will fiercely recommend picking up the book if you haven't already. There's a good chance you might not like it, it's a controversial read, but worth it nonetheless, if you ask me. Sally Rooney is, and probably always will be, considered a modern literary icon. Her books are endlessly showcased in book aesthetic Instagram pictures that garner tens of thousands of likes. Her newest release created buzz like no other in the online literary community, and with 2 of her stories cemented in the world of cinema, there seems to be no slowing down for her. But I think taking a look at Normal People and Conversations with Friends, the series, is a tale of the triumphs and pitfalls of complex storytelling. Despite this video somehow surpassing the hour mark, I didn't even come close to discussing all of the character and plot nuances of both of these stories. Whether or not you're the target demographic of modern sad girl, I think the Sally Rooney cinematic universe has a lot to offer, and I definitely still recommend watching these shows for yourself. Normal People more so, but I digress. I think that both of these shows do succeed in showcasing Rooney's original intentions. The human experience, even or maybe especially in mundanity, is worth exploring. Not as a problem to solve or as a backdrop on which we should impose what it should be. Rather, we should acknowledge all the messy and complicated truths and nuances of the lived experience and find a way to be okay, even when we don't have it all figured out.
That actually when the scripts came through, like, even though you're kind of following Frances, you're seeing, you know, what people are saying. And I found it really interesting how, like, you know, you could go back to a certain point in the book and, like, Frances would say, like, for example, Bobby said this, and then in the script it would be a little bit different, and that would teach me a little about, oh, that's how Frances interpreted that, you know. Yeah. So, like, it actually taught me so much, those little shifts and changes of about her as a person and how she kind of reads things. So I found that really interesting, I think.